So today we're going to be talking about section 5.4, which is about isosceles triangles. So you'll need to turn to page 140 in your workbook to get started. We're first going to start with the vocab. So I know it says in your own words write the meaning of each vocabulary term, but we're going to go through them together. So the first one we're going to talk about is the legs. The legs are the two sides of the triangle. And in an isosceles triangle, the legs are congruent. So take a minute, pause the video, and write that in your workbook. And over here on the right, I just drew a triangle and marked with tick marks the legs of the triangle. And they are marked congruent, considering this is an isosceles triangle. Next, we're going to talk about the vertex angle. And the vertex angle is the angle formed by the legs. And on the right there, I drew a picture, and in green, I circled the vertex angle. Where the two legs meet is the vertex of the triangle. Next is the base, and the base is the third side of the triangle, and in the picture above I highlighted it in blue. So the legs are on the sides that form the vertex, and the base is the third side of the triangle. Lastly, we're going to talk about the base angles. And the base angles are the two angles adjacent to the base. And in the picture above in black, I have located the base angles of the triangle. Now, moving down, still on page 140, you're going to see two theorems there. But what I'd like you to do is just go down to that bottom section where there's area to write some notes. And I would like you to draw these two pictures. So pause the video and take a minute to write down these two pictures. These pictures represent the two theorems stated above. If we look at the one I have written in red, it says if two sides are equal, then what happens? Well, what happens is if you have an isosceles triangle, meaning that two sides are congruent, then what happens is the triangle's base angles, so I'm going to redraw my picture, mark my congruent sides. What happens is the base angles are congruent also. And the converse of that, which is another theorem, if you have two angles that are equal, then what happens is the sides are congruent. So I'm going to redraw my picture again and then mark that since my base angles are congruent, then my legs are congruent also. So now moving on to page 141, we see we have two more corollaries here of our theorems, but I'd like you to slide down to the notes section and we're going to draw a picture for this one as well. So please draw this picture for this section. So take a moment to pause the video and draw the red and the blue triangle I have here. Once you've gotten these drawn, if we look over at the red triangle, this is simply saying if all the sides of the triangle are congruent, meaning it is equilateral, then what happens is that the triangle is also equiangular, which means all three sides are congruent as well as the angles. So if you are equilateral, then you are also equiangular. And if you look over at the second picture, this says if you're equiangular, then what you can assume is that you are also equilateral. So if all the angles are given congruent, then all the sides are congruent as well. So then you are equilateral. Okay, so moving on to some practice problems. This is at the bottom of page 141. So let's go ahead and look at numbers 1 through 4. It says to complete the statement and use the theorem, or state the theorem that you use, So number 1 says if nj is congruent to nm. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark that. I've got nj is congruent to nm. So then it says what two angles must be congruent. So what I should see is this triangle here. So those two legs are congruent, which means these two angles here should be congruent, because if the legs are congruent, then the base angles are congruent. So it should be angle J is congruent to angle M. Okay, as far as the theorem or your explanation is, you would just say definition of isosceles triangle, or you can explain in words if the legs are congruent, then the base angles are congruent. So now let's look at the second one. It says if LM is congruent to LN. So I'm going to find LM is here, and LN is congruent. So now the triangle I'm looking at is this one, because I'm using those legs to determine the triangle. I find the legs and then I find the third side to complete the triangle. So then it asks what angles are congruent. So then I look, if those legs are congruent, then the base angle's M, and this part of N is congruent. So I can say angle M is congruent to, I can't call this angle right here N because there's multiple angles coming off of it. So I will call it angle LNM. And why? Same reason as above. If the legs are congruent, then the base angles are congruent. Moving on to number 3, we have if angle NKM, so I'm going to find that. Remember, the middle one is the vertex, so NKM is right here, is congruent to NMK right here. Then it wants to know what sides are congruent is what it's looking for. So those are base angles. So that should tell me right here this is the base of my triangle, and then the two other sides are the rest of my triangle. So if the base angles are congruent, then I know that NK and NM are also congruent. So NK, that's an N, is congruent to NM. Okay, and then lastly we have number 4. It says if angle LJN, so LJ to N is right here, is congruent to LNJ, L to N to J, so I'm ignoring that line that has K attached to it, and I'm looking at this big triangle right here. Then I know if those two base angles are congruent, I know the distance from L to J is congruent to L to N. So now going on to page 142, let's look at numbers 5 and 6. It says for 5 and 6 to find the value of x. So if I look at number 5, what I first need to recognize is what kind of triangle am I in. All 3 angles are marked congruent, so that means I am in an equiangular triangle. And what we just talked about was if we have an equiangular triangle, that means that also all the sides are congruent. So I can go ahead and just say all of these sides are congruent. X is on one of the legs, and I notice here that one of the legs is 31. So if it's equiangular, and that means it's equilateral, that means that X will also be 31. So your explanation would be that if you have an equiangular triangle, it's also equilateral. Number 6, we also need to find x. If you notice here in this triangle, x is inside the angle attached to a 2. So I need to observe my triangle and the markings and the labels and determine what kind of triangle it is. Each side length is 12. That means this is an equilateral triangle, so I'll just go ahead and mark that right there. If it's equilateral, and we'll go ahead and write that down, it's equilateral, that should also tell me that it is equiangular. So then I know that all 3 of these angles are congruent. But what we should notice here is that we don't know the value of the angles. But if it's equiangular, now we have to pull our knowledge from a few sections ago that we know that inside a triangle all 3 angles equal 180. And if it's equiangular, that means I can take 180 divided by 3 to find the value of each angle. So I know that every equiangular triangle, the angles inside are 60 degrees. So that means this angle is 60, this angle is 60, as well as this one here. So if there's a value in there, or a label, I can set 2x equal to 60 to solve for x. Once I solve, I should get my x to be 30. And there I'm finished because the question was to find the value of x. Okay, so moving on now to exercise 7 and 8, it says find the values of x and y. So this one's a little trickier. There's 2 triangles in one, and what I want you to focus on first is this triangle here that I'm highlighting in blue. All the sides are congruent, which makes this an equilateral triangle, which should tell us automatically from the last problem that each angle is 60 degrees. Then what I would like you to notice is that this right here is a 90-degree angle, and if we know a piece of it, the 60-degree piece, then we should know that this piece over here in the smaller triangle is 30 by doing 90 minus 60. So 90 minus 60 gave us 30 there. So now I'm going to highlight the other triangle in green, and I want you to focus on that one. We know this is 30 degrees here, but if you notice, the two other angles are marked congruent. And since all the angles in a triangle equal 180, I can take 180 minus 30, the piece that I already know, and get 150. And since the two angles left in the green triangle are congruent, I would divide 250 by 2. So then I would get 75 degrees to be these two angles here. So y is going to be 75 degrees. And remember yesterday I was saying that once you find a variable, it's the same within the entire problem. So once we've found y, I also know this y, so it is 75 minus 25 to find that extra side length. And that side length would be 50. So if this side is 50, that means all of these are 50. Now, I'm going to erase everything I have on this triangle and just fill in now the values that I know, so maybe it's a little easier to see. I know this is 30. I know that each of these are 75. I know each side length, I'll do in blue, is 50. But what I really need to focus here is the green triangle again, because all I'm missing is x. If you notice in the green triangle, it's sitting kind of upside down, the base angles are congruent. So if this side length here is 50 degrees, sorry, not degrees, 50, then x is also going to be 50. Okay, and then our last problem will be number 8. So if you look at number 8, we also have two triangles here as well. What I first want you to look at is the top triangle I'm highlighting in green here. The legs are congruent, which should tell me that the base angles are congruent. Since I know that the top angle is 40, I can take 180 and subtract 40 to get 140, and know that I have 140 degrees left inside that triangle. And since the base angles are congruent, all I have to do is divide that by 2. And 140 divided by 2 would be 70. So I have just found my value of x. So x is going to be 70. Now next, you need to look at the other triangle below, which I'll highlight in blue here. If you notice, there is an x there. Once I've found x once, I can plug it in. So now I have two side lengths that are marked congruent, and since they're congruent, I can set them equal. So I will take 2y plus 10 and set it equal to 70 minus y to solve for x. So if I solve that, and I'm going to add the y over here and subtract the 10 over here, I get 3y equals 60, and if I divide by 3, my y will be 20. So make sure you got all those notes. Please go back and re-watch or pause the video so you can fill in your notes, and then you have the rest of the hour to work on this homework assignment. Make sure that you do have this ready for Monday, and I'll see you guys then. Have a great weekend.